there's a generation that almost nobody talks about. Too young to fully belong to Generation X, yet somehow too old to feel like millennials. They remember rotary phones hanging on kitchen walls, but they also remember the moment the first iPhone changed everything. They grew up in a world without the internet, without social media, without smartphones, and then, just as they were becoming adults, the entire world suddenly went digital. Sociologists eventually gave them a name, Xennials, a small microgeneration born roughly between 1976 and 1985. And what makes them fascinating isn't just their timing in history, it's the mindset that timing created. Because psychologically, they may represent one of the most adaptable groups ever raised. So the real question is this: why do people born between 1976 and 1985 think so differently from every other generation? To understand this generation, we first need to understand the term Xennial itself. The word began appearing around 2014, when sociologists started noticing that people born in a small window of time didn't quite fit the typical generational labels. Officially, Generation X includes those born roughly between 1965 and 1980, while millennials are usually defined as people born between 1981 and 1996. But individuals born between 1976 and 1985 seem to share experiences from both sides. Researchers began referring to them as Xennials, a microgeneration sitting right between the two. What makes this group unusual is the environment they grew up in. Their childhood took place in a mostly analog world, a time before smartphones, social media, and constant internet access. But by the time they were entering adulthood, society had already shifted into a digital era. In contrast, most Gen X adults encountered technology later in life, while millennials were already growing up alongside it. Xennials, however, experienced both worlds during the exact years when their identity and worldview were forming. That historical position is incredibly rare, and it may have created something unique, a hybrid psychological mindset shaped by both analog independence and digital adaptability at the same time. To really understand Xennials, we have to look at what their childhood actually felt like, because growing up in the pre-internet world created a completely different daily rhythm. Communication was simple. If you wanted to talk to a friend, you called their house using a landline phone. And if they weren't home, that was it. You tried again later. Many people even memorized the phone numbers of their closest friends, something that feels almost strange today. In school, passing messages meant folding a small paper note and sliding it across a desk. Conversations didn't leave a permanent record. They simply existed in the moment and disappeared. Entertainment worked the same way. You watched television when it aired. If your favorite show started at 7 o'clock, you had to be sitting on the couch at 7. And if you missed it, there was no replay waiting for you later. No Netflix, no YouTube, no streaming services. Even meeting friends required a kind of trust that feels rare today. There were no text messages and no GPS maps to guide you. You simply agreed on a place and time, showed up, and hoped your friends did the same. Growing up this way quietly shaped certain psychological skills. It encouraged patience, the ability to tolerate boredom, and comfort with direct face-to-face interaction. These experiences may seem small now, but they formed habits that many fully digital generations rarely had the chance to develop. Then something extraordinary happened. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the world began changing at a speed few people had ever experienced before. The internet didn't slowly blend into daily life, it exploded into it. First came email, allowing people to communicate instantly across long distances. Then there were chat rooms, where strangers from different parts of the world could suddenly talk in real time. Soon after, instant messaging appeared, turning online conversations into something constant and immediate. And that was only the beginning. Within a few years, the social landscape shifted again. Platforms like Friendster introduced the idea of online social networks. Then came MySpace, where profiles, music, and digital identities became part of everyday life. Not long after that, Facebook arrived and began connecting entire social circles online. What made this transformation remarkable was its speed. In what felt like only a few years, communication went from just a handful of methods, home phone, work phone, maybe showing up in person, to dozens of digital options. For Xennials, this wasn't technology they gradually grew up with. It was a massive shift happening right as they were building careers, relationships, and adult identities. And psychologically, adapting during that life stage changes how people think about the world. To understand why Xennials adapted so effectively to this shift, it helps to look at the science of brain development. Neuroscience research shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, planning, and adapting to new situations, does not fully mature until around age 25. This region is crucial for learning complex systems and adjusting behavior when environments change. Now, consider the timing. When the internet and digital communication began spreading rapidly in the late 1990s and early 2000s, many Xennials were still in their late teens or early 20s. In other words, their brains were still in a period of high adaptability. This created a powerful combination. They were young enough to learn new technologies quickly, often without fear or resistance. At the same time, they were old enough to clearly remember what everyday life looked like before those technologies existed. That dual perspective is rare. It gave many Xennials the ability to understand and navigate two different social systems: the slower, analog world they grew up in, and the fast, hyper-connected digital world that followed. One way to understand the psychology of Xennials is to think of them as a culturally bilingual generation. Just as someone who speaks two languages can move between different ways of thinking, Xennials learned to operate in two completely different cultural systems. The first was analog culture, a world built around face-to-face interaction, slower communication, and physical experiences. The second was digital culture, where communication became instant, constant, and increasingly online. Because they lived through the transition between these two systems, many Xennials developed the ability to move comfortably between them. They can sit through long, direct conversations without feeling the need to constantly check their phones. At the same time, they usually have little trouble adapting to new technologies, apps, or digital tools. This places them in an unusual position compared to other generations. Many members of Generation X encountered digital technology later in life, which can sometimes make them more skeptical or cautious about it. On the other hand, Gen Z has never experienced a world without the internet. Xennials stand somewhere in the middle. They remember what life felt like before constant connectivity, but they also understand how to function within it. That experience often produces a balanced mindset, one that is comfortable with technology but not entirely dependent on it, and capable of maintaining a healthier balance between online life and the physical world. Another interesting psychological difference appears in how Xennials relate to privacy and personal memory. During their teenage years, the digital environment we take for granted today simply didn't exist. There was no social media, no smartphones constantly recording moments, and certainly no culture of documenting everyday life online. Most people didn't walk around with cameras in their pockets. Photos were taken occasionally, often with disposable cameras, and many moments were never recorded at all. That meant many awkward or embarrassing experiences simply faded with time. Maybe it was a terrible haircut in middle school, an uncomfortable breakup, or a night at a party that didn't go quite as planned. Moments like these existed briefly in memory, but they rarely left permanent evidence. There were no viral videos, no old photos resurfacing years later, and no searchable archive of teenage mistakes. As a result, many Xennials developed a different relationship with their past. Memories were allowed to evolve and soften over time. Personal stories could change shape as people grew older without being permanently frozen in digital form. This created a unique psychological distance from the past, where identity could gradually change without constant reminders of who someone used to be. Another major factor that shaped the psychology of Xennials wasn't technological, it was economic. Many people born between the late 1970s and mid-1980s entered the workforce during one of the most unstable financial moments in modern history, the global financial crisis of 2008. Just as they were trying to establish careers, build savings, and gain independence, entire industries were collapsing. Companies were cutting jobs, housing markets were crashing, and economic uncertainty became part of everyday life. For many young professionals at that time, opportunities suddenly became limited. Some struggled with unemployment, others experienced unstable income, and many had to delay major life decisions such as buying homes or starting families. Psychological research suggests that economic hardship during early adulthood can leave lasting mental patterns. Experiences like job insecurity or financial loss often influence how people think about money, risk, and long-term stability. When someone goes through financial instability during those formative years, the impact tends to stay with them long after the crisis ends. Because of this, many Xennials developed a mindset that blends adaptability with caution. They learned how to adjust when circumstances change. But they also tend to approach financial decisions with a greater sense of awareness and careful planning. In many ways, Xennials can be described as a generation of paradoxes. They often carry characteristics that seem to pull in opposite directions at the same time. Many of them are highly independent, shaped by a childhood that required self-reliance and problem-solving without constant supervision. Yet they also understand the importance of collaboration and networks in a connected world. They can be skeptical, especially when it comes to hype around new technologies or trends. At the same time, they tend to remain cautiously optimistic about innovation and progress. Perhaps the most interesting contradiction is that they are both analog and digital. They remember the slower rhythm of life before the internet, when communication took time and attention wasn't constantly divided. But they also adapted to a world where information moves instantly and connection is always available. Because of this perspective, Xennials often see technological change more clearly than other generations. They are not as nostalgic for the past as many Gen Xers, yet they are also not completely dependent on technology. They remember what the world looked like before the digital era, and that memory helps them understand both what we gained and what we quietly lost. Ultimately, the story of Xennials isn't really about claiming that this generation is somehow superior or more important than others. What makes their experience meaningful is the moment in history they lived through. They grew up during one of the fastest social and technological transformations humanity has ever experienced. Within a single decade, the world moved from analog routines to a permanently connected digital reality. And living through that transition taught many Xennials a valuable skill: how to adapt without losing their sense of identity. In a world where technology, culture, and work continue to change faster every year, that ability may become one of the most important strengths anyone can have. If this perspective resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next fascinating psychology video.